Playlist Party with your host, Don Lombardi.
And today the producer of the show is the producer with the most, Jules. That's her voice. She likes to be behind the scenes, but you saw a little image of her there at the beginning in the promo there. She had her disco outfit on a little bit there, just an outline of Jules there. So Jules, I want to thank you for putting these all on for the last long period of time. This is actually the wrap up to the playlist party. So I'm going to be playing the last list of playlists here for a while anyway. Maybe we'll get into more of them next year. I want to thank you for joining me. Usually these are done with Jules in the DW office, which is actually down the hall because I'm not doing this from my house. This might look a little familiar to you. I'm doing this from the set where we do the Drum Channel Lombardi live shows. If you have any questions you'd like to ask about anything, especially what I'm going to be talking about today, please just send them in, right? And I have Elias in here who's going to be helping with you like he does with the shows. So I'd love to answer any questions you've got also. You know, talking about playlists, I thought what I'd do is go over some things, introduce you, I think, to some things maybe that you might not know about. Even some older drummers, I'm surprised, don't know about some of these musicians that I'm going to be talking to you about today. And kind of a way I would present a lot of information to students during the years when I was teaching. For years I taught 40, 50 students a week. And I'd often say, you know, if the world was flat and you put in the four corners of the world Elvin Jones, Buddy Rich, Mel Lewis, and Ringo Starr, you would have kind of a little bit of what every other drummer could possibly be made out of. Not that there wasn't other seminal artists that would also fit into those categories, Tony Williams, of course, and many more. But basically, if you took, like, thinking of the rhythmic sensibility of Elvin Jones, and then you have the technique of Buddy Rich, the simplicity of Ringo Starr, the musicality of Mel Lewis. And Mel Lewis might not be a name a lot of you are familiar with out there. You'd have to be kind of a jazz aficionado to know Mel. I think everyone knows Elvin Jones from the seminal albums that he made with John Coltrane, at least the name if you've studied in college or you're going to college or even studying music in high school. Buddy Rich, another name that's well known to everybody, and of course Ringo Starr. I'm not going to play any Ringo Starr tracks because I think everybody knows those. And everybody knows the Buddy tracks too. I can always tell a couple of Buddy stories because I was fortunate enough to meet all of these people. Never met Ringo, but Buddy, Elvin, Mel, I did have an opportunity to meet. So I'm going to show you some artists that I don't think you know about. Frankie Butler. I'm going to play an amazing drum solo, something that I'd never heard before in my life and I haven't heard anything like it since. I'll give you a little hook as to what that's about. Mel Lewis, I'm going to tell you how I influenced Mel Lewis. Really, you're going to think, is this guy crazy? I did something that Mel found out about, and then he did it, and that was a big influence on him. And I'll fill you in on what that is too. I told that story recently in a Drum Channel show when I interviewed Terry Gibbs, who was the leader of the band that Mel Lewis was in when Mel was really prominent here in the LA scene. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about the best cymbal crash of all time. If there was an award, modern drummer, they have all these awards for like zillions of different things and categories that I didn't even know existed. But they don't have best cymbal crash because that's a tough one. And it's not just my opinion. I'm going to be reflecting on the opinion of, in that case, it's Freddie Gruber's opinion also. And I'll play you what that is, which also happened to be a track from a record that I used to listen to every night. I'd say 5 nights a week for at least 5 or 6 years. I would come home from playing at the club in a rock band. It was called the Crickets. And I'd have to kind of center myself, being a jazz guy, and listen to this one record. And I listened to that almost every night. And that happened to have the best cymbal crash of all time. So I'll tell you more about what that is. You're also going to hear a great rock band whose name you probably don't even know because they were not together very long, but it's one of the better rock bands of all time. You can learn a tremendous amount from listening to the drummer in this band. I'll give it away now. The drummer in the band was Jim Keltner. So we'll play a little track from that also. But let's start out with talking about Mel Lewis. Mel, I'll give you my story, how I influenced Mel Lewis. Might as well get that out of the way first. So I'm studying with Nick 𝗟𝗢𝗓. Started playing drums when I was 14 with a local music teacher, a professional drummer in town, playing in show bands and studio work. His name was Nat Leslie. I studied with him for 2 years, and then he fell into some ill health, so I then was hanging out at Pro Drum Shop. When I got my driver's license at 15 and a half in those days, first thing I did was shoot down to, you're not supposed to be driving with anybody, but my friend and I did drive my friend at 15 and a half down to Pro Drum Shop and got to meet and hang out with Bob Yeager. Pro Drum Shop was the place where all the drummers came to in those days and in later generations and even today to get the service that they're looking for and to kind of hang out with just the history, if you look at the walls when you're in Pro Drum Shop, of all the drummers that were there. So I got to meet Bob Yeager, who was running it back in those days, and the other people that worked there, and we became friends. And I told him I was looking for another drum teacher, and he said Nick 𝗟𝗢𝗓, who I had not known, had just moved into town after traveling with Ray Anthony. And there's a little bit to that story too, because his last tour with Ray Anthony was into Brazil. If Elias, remind me, and I'll finish that story a little bit later. Nothing to do with the playlist party that we're doing here, but I'm going to want to take lessons. So he introduced me to Nick. Nick and I became friends, and I started studying with Nick at his house. And Nick 𝗟𝗢𝗓 knew Mel Lewis, so Nick introduced me to Mel Lewis. So my story is, as a 15 and a half year old, I get my grandfather's car for my birthday, which was a 6 or 7 year old. It was a 58 Ford, or rather Chevy Bel Air, and that was it. That was the cool thing to have wheels in those days, and so I drove that for a while I was studying with Nick 𝗟𝗢𝗓. I'm getting to the story here, and that wasn't a very good car to carry drums around in, so I traded it in for a Volkswagen blue hatchback. And as I drove to Nick's house to take a lesson, he saw the car and he thought, this is really cool. He wanted to get a new car, so he bought a blue Volkswagen hatchback. And he was going to the studios and playing, and Mel Lewis saw his blue Volkswagen hatchback, and he bought a blue Volkswagen hatchback. And that's how I influenced Mel Lewis. He would not have got a blue Volkswagen hatchback if I didn't have one. And fast forward the story, about another year, Yeager would tell me when Mel was playing in Terry Gibbs's big band, which was the exciting Terry Gibbs Big Band. That was the name of their CD, and it was called the Dream Band. If you're playing in a big band, or a professional drummer that's looking at expanding your horizon, and you're going to play in a big band at one point, you've got to study Mel Lewis. And this is the best band to study Mel Lewis in. As Freddie Gruber once said, and I would agree, the Dream Band is the best white band of all time. And it wasn't a band that traveled. It was studio guys in town. It was great charts, and it was a crazy fun band, basically. I had the opportunity when they recorded their first album, which was at the Summit, I believe it was, in Hollywood, to go down there with John Gross. We drove down. I was about 16 years old, and we couldn't get in because we weren't of age, which turned out to be really nice, except it was a rainy night, as I remember it. And I remember it pretty well. So we didn't want to leave. We went behind the club, which was kind of cantilevered on a hill, and got, sat down in the mud and was kind of almost right under the bandstand, where you had Buddy Clark playing bass, rattling the floor. I mean, you could hear the bass. It was almost amplified. Mel Lewis playing drums. We sat there and just listened for as long as we could until we got too soaking wet. But listening to the drummer and the bass player work together, an upright bass, listen to the way Mel Lewis played time. And that was a thing Freddie used to bring up to me. Mel's time and cymbal rhythm, you could drive a truck through it. We're going to talk about cymbal rhythms a little bit, because you got Mel Lewis's, you got Elvin Jones, you've got what was happening with bebop in the late 50s and the late 60s, the way the cymbal rhythm was played. Keeping in mind that the cymbal rhythm for a jazz drummer is kind of his signature, if you will. And me, as a teenager, this is another kind of interesting time in history. at 15 years old, 16 years old, in 1960, everything that was going on in the music industry was just amazing. Drums too, and we're going to kind of reflect on that a little bit, that, you know, the history, what happened in that kind of a 10-year period. But Mel Lewis, the Dream Band with Terry Gibbs, here's kind of an example of what I'm talking about. And I used to play this for my students. It's one, and you can go on to Amazon and look up Dream Band. There's the exciting Terry Gibbs Big Band. Explosion is another album, and those two are both ones that Terry felt were, you know, kind of the seminal albums. They made several albums after that that were almost a little bit studio-ish albums, but these were live, recorded live, playing at a, you know, 2 nights, 3 nights at a set. The band was crazy. Unfortunately, some of the members of the band were literally crazy. 2 of them actually committed suicide, which is a tragic story in their much later life. But it was a band that was just all fun. And when Nick Ceroli taught how to play in a big band, or most drummers, you learn that there's 3 options. You can play the figure, exactly what the band's playing. You can play around the figure, or you can play a little bit both. And there's books written about that. And then when we'd studied learning how to play a big band, when I was studying with Nick, another opportunity came up, which was the 4th way, and that was trying to figure out what Mel Lewis was doing, because he would literally change the pattern and add to it. And just listen to the Dream Band here. I'm going to play a track for you, and I'm going to count this 2 different ways. It's going to bring up a point. This is called Limerick Waltz, which is in 3/4, but I want you to hear the fill, the 8-bar fill that Mel plays, and then we're going to play it again. We're going to count it in 3, and we're going to count it in 4. Check this out. This is Limerick Waltz. Short track. Let's listen. We're going to listen to the whole thing. It's only a couple minutes. As Freddie would say, Mel would open up the 16th note on the jazz cymbal ride almost to a triplet. Says yes, cymbal rhythm was so wide open you could drive a truck through it. Gave plenty of room for the 15 members of the band to play. This was recorded in 1961. When I was behind the club listening to it, sitting in the mud. Okay, here we go. Count it with me. So, kind of a tricky example, but Jules, let's fade that out and go back and play that again, like the last 30, 40 seconds, and listen to the drum. Basically, the point I'm making here is that the way Mel Lewis played, the way all these great drummers played, was not linearly. It wasn't thinking of the time or playing in 3. It was hearing a pattern and playing that pattern. They were playing harmonically, which is a big lesson, you know, a big part of the lessons that I have on the Drum Channel site also. But listen to this one more time, and we'll count it as 3 bars of 4. listen to it, grab it on your own. And when you listen to that, it's fun to count it out. You can count it out as obviously 8 bars of 3, which is what it is. It's not, you're playing 6 bars of 4. It's in 3/4 the whole song is, obviously. But when you listen to the way he phrased it, it wasn't like you were hearing 3/4. You were just hearing a pattern that happened to fill up that space of time. And he was dubbed by Terry Gibbs the Tailor, Mel Lewis. Terry said because he walked like a tailor, but I also heard it's because he would tailor the songs in a way in which he would actually change a figure as opposed to just playing the figure the way it was written for the band. And it all worked. Mel Lewis was one of Buddy Rich's favorite drummers. Frank DeVito used to say Buddy Rich used to always pick his favorite drummers as those that did not have a lot of technique, as Mel wasn't known as a real technician. But if you're playing in a big band, Elias, you've heard, Elias is a great big band drummer, by the way. Plays in the Union band, sight reads big bands. We're going to get some of these tracks as drumless tracks so that we can do them as play-alongs. But you've checked out Mel Lewis before.
Of course, yeah.
It's unbelievable.
There's also a picture of you and Mel that you wanted to
Yeah, I do have a picture of me and Mel, too, that I took in the early days. There it is, yep. That was at a NAMM show when we had one of our first parties. That was after I had met Mel. Before I had, and Nick Ceroli had introduced me to them, and we'd actually hung out at his house on one occasion. I know it was at a NAMM show because that's the only time I'd be wearing a tie and a white shirt. But it was our, I would say 1980 or 81, and it was when we had our first jam at the NAMM show. After the NAMM shows, all these other companies had big parties. We took a little room at Stovall's and had a trio playing jazz, and it was like a huge hit. All the dealers came over and thought it was really cool. Mel sat in, Nick Ceroli sat in, Shelly Mann came over and played also. But before I met Mel, when I heard the band was rehearsing at the Union, back to Pro Drum Shop, Bob Yeager would clue me in that, hey, Terry's going to be rehearsing with Mel Lewis and the Dream Band at the Union, which is right across the street from Pro Drum Shop, like whatever day it was a Saturday or a Thursday. So, of course, he knew I wanted to check it out. So I went down, and I hadn't met Mel yet. I pulled into a parking spot at the Union, and sure enough, he pulled in 2 spots over. I had my blue Volkswagen van, he had his blue Volkswagen van. So I thought it would be a good thing to break the ice. And it was ended up being quite a lesson, actually. So I kind of cleverly wait, and I'm nervous. I wait till he opens the back of the hatchback, and he gets his trap case out on wheels, puts the bass drum on top of it, and I walk over, and I say, hey, Mel, Don Lombardi, student of Nick Ceroli's, he saw me get my van, and I know that's how you got your Volkswagen van. And so he said, yeah, that was fun. I said, I'll help you carry your toms in. He said, no, that's okay. And he shut the door, and he just wheeled his trap case in his bass drum. And I thought, that's a little bit stuffy. I mean, does he think I'm going to run off with them? Or I was just offering to help carry his toms in, his floor tom and his rack tom. So I walk over to Pro Drum Shop and buy some things. By they come back, they had started rehearsing. And I peek in the window because the door is open to watch him. And he's sitting on his trap case with the bass drum and the snare drum, one ride cymbal, and that was it. And from listening to play a big band, the lesson was that's all you need to play a big band. The other thing is icing on. He never took his floor tom or his bass drum, and there was a message there, I felt. And there's a message, that we can carry on for you too. So moving on here, Mel Lewis, big influence on every drummer and somebody that you should look into and know more about. Next, we're going to take a look at somebody who rocked the world of drumming back in the day. The album was A Love Supreme, and if you can imagine, thinking about the drum set in general, back in the 30s and 40s, the bass drum was played on 1, 2, 3, and 4. It wasn't until the late 40s when bebop started happening, where drummers took the ride cymbal pattern to be the time, and they would play the bass drum and the snare drum as part of the figures, of course keeping time on the hi-hat too. And so Jimmy Chapin wrote his infamous book, Modern Approach to Independence, Coordinated Independence, which is a book that I imagine a lot of you, if you've studied formally out there, have gone through, because it's kind of the Bible of that way. And the right hand would play the jazz cymbal rhythm all the way through it. And you would play, I thought at 14, 15, 16, 17, I kind of had the book down. I was listening to Jimmy Cobb with Miles Davis. We're going to talk about that in a little bit too. But figured the jazz cymbal rhythm was da, 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 that was, you know, emphasis on 2 and 4. And then all of a sudden, and you got that down, then you hear Elvin Jones with Coltrane, and it's like a whole other world. Not only is he playing the accent on the 16th note of the cymbal rhythm, da, 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 instead of da, 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 he was musically doing something that other drummers hadn't done before in a rhythm section like that. And real long form explanation, he was kind of bringing the African feel into jazz and bebop, which was the heritage where it came from in the first place. And let's listen a little bit to A Love Supreme, which is, I actually have my album here that I bought when I was a kid, to Elvin Jones, and I'm going to show you a couple of other of my favorite Elvin Jones albums. I don't know if they still exist anywhere, if they're still out there or not, but let's check out a little bit of John Coltrane and My Favorite Things. This is another good example. It's in 3. Try counting in 4. Feels good also. You doing that, Elias? I bought this album when I was 15, and it freaked me out because I played it 3 times in a row, and it wasn't until the 3rd time that it struck me that it's in 3, because it just felt so good. Love Supreme was the other seminal John Coltrane album. So this was in about 1960. You've got to listen to what Elvin Jones did to the drumming world in those days. And my hangout of all time back in those days was Shelley's Manhole, where if you can think about a teenager having the opportunity to see close up in a small club all of these great musicians, it's just, and Shelley was a friend. I didn't hang out with Shelley, but he knew me, and he would be really helpful in having me get into the club, get into the area in the back of the club. He'd let me stand back there. We've got a couple of Elvin stories that'll be interesting too. So Dear John C. is another album that you probably don't know about that I have in my collection. Elias is putting his thumbs up. You know about Dear John C. It's a good one for sure. And here's one that's a little obscure. Let's see if Elias knows this one. Does anybody know this one? And then again, Elvin Jones. Did I scoop you?
I've seen that.
You've seen it? Okay. It's a great one also. So basically, Elvin became so popular with Coltrane, the record labels decided they would put some groups together and have him have his own. He was with Coltrane during that period of time. It wasn't like he went off on his own, but they would have him put out some of his own records too, which was really neat. So a thrill for me as a teenager, and I must have been 16 or 17 because I hadn't got my blue Volkswagen hatchback yet. I was still driving my grandfather's car that I got as a 15-and-a-half-year-old birthday present. I got a call from a friend. Barbara Donalds was a woman jazz trumpet player in town who was pretty well known on the West Coast in those days. And we would play together on occasion, and she was a good friend. And she was Elvin Jones's girlfriend. When Coltrane would come into town, they would hang out together. So she calls me up. This is in the days when you picked up a telephone and you had a a call, you know. She calls me up and says, "You want to drive Elvin and me to Shelley's to the gig?" So Coltrane's playing at a club, a nightclub. I mean, this is not like, you know, Staples Center. This is a small club. In fact, we have a picture of Shelley's, I think we can put up in a little bit, the manhole. Yeah, that was the place that where I grew up. It was at the Lighthouse, which was in Hermosa Beach, which still is there, not playing jazz as it did in the old days. But and then in later years, Shelley's manhole, which I think started maybe around 1960. I'll have to look that up. When I was 15 or 16, I believe. So she calls me up and says, "You want to drive Elvin and me to the club?" Because they were staying about 15 minutes away in a little townhouse. And I'm like, "Barbara, I'm going to be a nervous wreck. I can't pick Elvis Jones up." He said, "Yeah, come on and do it. Just pick us up and drive us to the club." So here's a little backstory. So I say, "Okay, I'll do it." And I get the address. I get my Thomas guide out. I get there a half hour ahead of time because I'm not the one that wants to have Elvin late to the club. And so she comes out, says he'll be out in just a few minutes. He has to stop on the way to get a vitamin B12 shot. And I'm saying, "Barbara, you're going to get me thrown in jail. I'm a nervous wreck as it is now." I knew Elvin had drug issues in those days. However, to this day, I still believe that, and she still swore to me, and she was a great friend, that he actually does, and I'd heard that he did get vitamin B12 shots before he went on to play. So I assume that's what it was. So 2 nights in a row, I got to pick Elvin Jones up, take him to Shelley's manhole, and Shelley would let me come in the back door and stand right behind him. And I mean, like, you're standing behind the drummer within 4 or 5 feet, just before the door that went into the kitchen. And it was kind of fun. Shelley said, "You know, you can," because the club was packed. There was no place to sit. You had to buy tickets ahead of time, you know. So I just walked in the back door with them when they showed up for the gig. So he just said, "No, stand right here by the kitchen door. And when you see the pitcher of beer by the floor tom get past half level, pick it up and give it to the waitress, so Elvin has a full pitcher of beer there all the time." And it wasn't like a glass of beer like you would have, you know. It was a pitcher like if somebody was pouring beer for 5 or 6 people at a table. He drank a lot of beer. But what was really fun was watching him play from that perspective. I wish there would be, you know, videos of that. Because when Elvin hit the scene, there was some comments about, "Oh, it's free jazz. He's doing things that are like, you know, totally different way that he'd be looking at what he was doing." And rhythmically, he certainly was. But when you saw him play, there was nothing free about it. Both of his legs were literally like you'd be walking down the street. Everything that he was playing through, the right knee would go up and down and the left would go up and down. You just see him go like this through everything that he was doing. And there's some explanations that Efren Toro gives on Drum Channel, insights about, you know, rhythmically how he was focusing on kind of what he was doing. And everybody tried to do that. Even Shelley Mann. It was like, "Oh, this is the new thing, so we've got to try and do it." And finally everybody realized that's Elvin's thing, because nobody was pulling it off. And that was his thing, and he was the one that did it. There was only one other drummer back in that day who I had known about, and talking with Freddie and other drummers who were on the scene back in that day, that could have pulled that off. And that was somebody that I don't think you've ever heard of. I think he's next on our playlist list. His name was Frankie Butler. And I'm going to play, this is, I think we're getting really obscure here. It's from a track. The track is called Night in Tunisia. It's an album that I had that was Red Mitchell, who was a bass player, but he played cello in this album, and he had a bass player on the record, and he played a drum solo. I'll give you the lead story getting into it. So Frank Butler was a great drummer here on the West Coast. He had a real heroin problem, and he spent a lot of years in jail. And in jail, the only way he could play and practice playing would be with his fingers on tables and things, because he didn't have drums, obviously. So he developed a technique where he could play rolls and play patterns off of his fingers by snapping his thumb. I'd seen him do it on a couple of occasions when he was playing clubs in town. I never really met Frank. I think once I did have a chance to say hello, but I never met him or had a chance to really talk with him. But would see him do it where he would flick his his fingernails off of his thumb and go across his hands, and could play long rolls, could play amazing things. And on this one particular album, he played a solo, and as you get into the solo, I'll point out a point at which he switches from sticks to playing with fingers, and then goes back again. Another Frank Butler story, just Google Frank Butler, and anything you can hear of him, you've got to check it out. I'm at, when Coltrane would come to town, I'd go to Shelley's and hear him play. I mean, pretty much, I was fortunate during the 15, 18 years that I played professionally. I was never out of work. I always had an opportunity to go either from one gig to the next, or I'd be on a gig and I'd get called to do another gig. So I would take, time off whenever Coltrane came into town, send a sub, or I'd take time off when Miles came into town. Again, Miles Davis playing at Shelley's Manhole, sitting like 10 feet from the band, hearing them play, 5 hours a night. Just moments of your life that you feel like they were yesterday still, all these years later. And when Buddy Rich would come into town, I'd go to Carnation Pavilion too, which is a whole other set of stories. But what Miles would do and what Coltrane would do sometimes when they come into town is they would play at Shelley's, which was their big gig, and they would do like 14 days there, usually 2 weeks. And then the night after they finished there, they would go to this club called the It Club, which was kind of a funky club in kind of the south central area of Los Angeles, and play 1 or 2 nights down there, kind of for the local crowd, who wouldn't have to necessarily pay the big budget of going to Shelley's. So I knew they were going to be there. It was on a Monday night, and it was on my night off. So John Good and I go to the It Club to hear Coltrane and Elvin play. And we get there at 9 o'clock. We're obviously the only 2 white people in this entire club. And it's packed. So we're in the hallway by the payphone, not able quite to get to the turn where you would be able to see the stage in front. And it's 9 o'clock, no Elvin. It's 10 o'clock, no Elvin. It's 11 o'clock, no Elvin. And coming around to the payphone is Train, and he gets on it, and I just hear him saying, "No, you don't need drums. Just bring your sticks. Everything's here. No, you don't need cymbals. Everything's here. Just get down here as quick as you can." So I don't know who he's talking to, but obviously he had given up on the idea of Elvin showing up. So about a half hour later, Frankie Butler shows up. And the amazing thing was, not being able to see the stand was an interesting perspective to this, because I just heard the audio of them playing. You would have not known it was not Elvin Jones. He's the only guy who understood what Elvin, that I knew of in those days, or have talked to people who really could do what Elvin was doing the way Elvin was doing it. The difference was when they took a break or they gave him a solo, he orchestrated a solo. Elvin would just have everybody stop and keep on playing, but Frank actually kind of orchestrated the solo as he'll orchestrate this solo. Let's play the solo and check it out. Can you bring the volume up a little bit for me, Jules? puts the sticks down. One stick down. Long solo, but it's a good one. Here we go. Fingers. This is all fingers. Still fingers. Listen to this roll. That's fingers. And he goes back, picks up one stick. It's long, but it's good. And they go back into the head. Anyways, fade that out. That just blew my mind when I'd hear him do that, when I heard him do it. And, you know, the backstory is kind of fascinating, too. It was one other Elvin Jones experience I had back at Shelley's again. At one point, they were in the middle of a solo, and Elvin and Coltrane would often, you know, get into it to where Jimmy Garrison, the bass player, would just stop, because it's like, you know, they're so intense on what they're doing back and forth, you know, it's like my part isn't adding anything to it at this moment. And so that was going on, and there was a feedback in the microphone, which was this really loud screech where you just, like, you know, would want to plug in your ears. And everybody stopped except Elvin. And I think he was, you know, probably so drunk at that point that he thought Coltrane was just hitting a loud note that just went on for maybe 2 or 3 minutes before they could stop the screeching. And then when the screeching stopped, he hit this big crash, and then the band came back in, and I don't think he ever knew what was going on. We laughed about that hysterically after that happened, too. In any event, a lot of fun times back in that era, and an unbelievable time, you know, for music. Then there's the best. So check out Frankie Butler, a guy you haven't even heard of. Best cymbal crash of all time. When it comes to swing, time, and feel, and where you can place the beat, check this out. It's from an album that everybody does know. It's Kind of Blue. And I have my original Kind of Blue album here, I believe, somewhere, which I bought when it was cheap back in those days. And that's the biggest selling jazz album of all time. Everybody that's studied, is aware of that. So What is the first track in the album, and I would get off when I was 17. I was in my senior year of high school. Started playing clubs 5 nights a week with a band called the Crickets, which was Nicky Sullivan, who was one of the original Crickets, and Buddy Holly's band, who passed away way before my time. And Nicky was on the West Coast and had just put a band together. Actually, it was kind of interesting because I'd worked with the bass player before who had worked with him, and they were putting a band together with, lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass, and drums. So the bass player said, "Why don't you come and audition?" So I thought, oh, I'm 17. They're all 3 or 4 years older than me. Nicky was probably 10 years older than me. He was older than the rest of the guys in the band. So I did set up my drums, get ready for the audition. They bring a microphone over, and I'm like, I didn't know this was an audition for a drummer that sings. I don't sing. So I just figured that's going to be the end of it. He said, let's play some songs. Just sing some, we're just doing some 4-part harmonies here. Just join us in here. We did a song, and obviously it didn't go well. They said, hold on for a minute, and we're going to go talk. So they went into the other room, and I figured, this is fun, but I didn't know it was a drummer that sings, and I don't sing. So they came back, and they said, we're going to like you to be in the band. Don't worry about singing. We're going to do 3-part harmonies. So I figured that was a good sign. My audition got me the gig, even though I didn't have to sing, which I didn't through the history of the years that we played. And that was probably 4 years. It was a club in LA, in Hollywood. It was across from PJ's, just down the street, on the other side of the street. Kind of a hot little, rock club. But it would be 5 days a week, and we'd end at 1:30, 1:45, usually 1:30. I'd get home about 2:15, 2:30, and I would put this record on almost every night just to get my sensibilities back to a different time feel, if you would. There was more where my head was, I guess, as a jazz aficionado back in those days. So let's listen to it, as it also encompasses one of the best cymbal crashes of all time, and I'll tell you why in a second. But check this out. So What, from Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. It's a long little intro to this. When I talk about the cymbal crash, for a couple of years, studied with Freddie Gruber for 3 years, really pretty steady. 2 years very steady, and then other times on and off. But I rented the house behind him at one point too, and we would talk a lot and listen to a lot of records. This is one of them, of course. We spent a lot of time breaking down Buddy Rich's technique, which is something that I've got in great detail information from Freddie on. But listen to this, because it's where the cymbal crash ends up the time with. Just how you have so much room, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute, with an upright bass and a ride cymbal. It's the crash, and the sustain of the crash is kind of so far behind the beat that I don't think you can listen to this and not feel like you've just gone through 5 hours of yoga or something. It's got to be the most relaxing thing to listen to in the world. Listen up. That's it right there. And fortunately had Jimmy Cobb out here at Drum Channel for 4 days with great roundtable interviews, and talked to him about that and asked him just how he did it with the cymbal and a brush, bump, ba-dum, bum. And that's, if you were to look at it on a graph, audio-wise, it's so far behind the beat when you actually hear the full bodiness of the crash, but it's exactly where the time fits in. And that's where you have time feeling with an upright bass and a ride cymbal. The upright bass kind of, it would be like a flatbed of a train car. So the whole band is moving down the line at the same rate of speed, but you've got enough room in that flatbed car when each note of the bass is played to play right in the middle of the bass note, a little bit behind the bass note, a little bit in front of the bass note. You got a lot of room to move to push the time and gel with the bass player. And once and obviously you can do that with an electronic bass too, but there's not as much body to an electronic bass as there is to an upright bass, where you're getting the resonance out of the body of the actual instrument itself. So take the experience when you can to find an upright bass player, especially if you're playing jazz, and play with him and just listen to the depth of the sound of that bass note and where you can position the cymbal note within it. Once you lock into a bass player, there's nothing like it. It's a drug. It's a high. One of the reasons why a lot of jazz musicians got high, they wanted to continue the high that they get from playing, and it would go vice versa too. They would high and think that it would make them play better, which is questionable, but interesting thing to think about. So Miles Davis Kind of Blue, obviously an album you've got to get and just play along to that track. I played along to it for many years as a teenager, and this came along when I was 15, 16 years old. This happening at the same time Elvin Jones was happening. A couple of years later, the same time the Beatles were happening. This was all within about a 5-year period. What an evolution of the drum set. And then there was Take 5, which of course is a seminal chart in the jazz world, playing in an odd time signature for the first time. And then there's looking at the way drummers looked at time signatures too. We've talked a lot about it on the Drum Channel website. And there's an interesting one I'm going to play for you to kind of wrap up here today, which is Take 5 and 7. And I know that sounds really weird, but it actually does work, and I'll prove it to you in a minute. Any questions you have? Anybody? Because I'd be happy to answer any questions that we have that are coming in. I would need binoculars in order to read them on the screen ahead of me because it's really small. But as long as you're enjoying the show and we're just kicking it off here for our first complete season of what we're doing, having these shows. Let's take a look at Efren Toro, who is a genius of rhythm. He is the person who taught Alex Acuna, Terry Bozzio. So many drummers look up to him. He's really off the grid. He's not somebody that's around, somebody else that you probably may not have heard about. That's part of what I'm doing today, is trying to introduce you to people you might not be aware of that I thought were very influential to the drumming community in the day. But let's play this for a second and count it in 5 and count it in 7. And the whole idea is that music, the way Elvin Jones was influenced by African rhythms, comes from dance, and it comes from thinking of things harmonically, how they sound and how they feel, as opposed to linearly, which is putting them into a time signature, if you will. And all the great drummers in the world, understand that. And the last group we're going to talk about, which is doing a similar thing we're talking about here, but in a kind of way, where it's obviously 4/4, you know where the beat is, but the beat isn't the most important thing. It's the feeling of the pulse that you get that makes the song sound really good. So here we are kind of differentiating the two. Here's 5 and here's 7. You play 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You play 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Can you interplay those both at the same time? Check this out. Listen really close.
Well, we do it in 7. Hey, yeah. Just take 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
I don't know if you can boost the audio up a little bit for me, Jules. Listen to the count. So, obviously, you can count in 5. 3, 4, 5. 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it's actually in 7. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Count it out both ways to yourself when you're hearing this. It's pretty weird. That's how he gets Alex and Terry and great drummers who are students of his to be able to go when they're playing something from 4 to 3 to 5 to 7. Within the same harmonic structure. Did you get that? That makes sense to you? You got it? So, if you could hear him at the beginning, do it where he actually counts it out in front of these people and he plays it 2 different ways. It gets wilder as it goes. All right. You can check this out. I think it's on our on the Drum Channel YouTube channel, and count it both ways for you, and you can hear it both ways. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Clap your hands in 5, 2, loud. 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So get a friend to clap 5, and then you clap in 7 around him, and you can get lost between I don't know if I'm in 5 or if I don't know if I'm in 7. Kind of a brain teaser, but it's pretty interesting when you think about being around guys who are like, at light years above me in terms of rhythmic sensibilities, with Terry and Efren and Alex Acuna, and great people that we've been able to have out to the Drum Channel site. Seeing them do these things back and forth and how easy it is. It's never easy when you're learning it, obviously, but for them to get into it and do it, and for you to experience it a little bit, just get a little, thought I'd throw a little extra spice into what we're doing here today. The last thing is not many stories to tell you about. I do want to go back to one thing with Frank Butler, by the way, something we didn't mention. If you listen to the great 7 Steps to Heaven album, which you think of 7 Steps to Heaven as Tony Williams, Miles Davis, right? But before Tony and Miles got together to finish the album, the first part of the album was done with Frank Butler and Victor Feldman. If you have the album, I'm looking off site because I'm looking at Elias over here. So do you have that album, Elias? 7 Steps?
Miles Davis, but not.
The original 7 Steps?
Yeah.
Well, the beginnings, if you have the complete album, the beginning of that is not with Tony. Tony came on and did the last 3 or 4 songs. Frank Butler and Victor Feldman are on for the first songs. Victor Feldman actually wrote 7 Steps. So The way I understood it from Cullen Bailey, who was in the studio with these guys at the time, this is my gossipy backstory, is that when the original band with Wynton Kelly and Paul Chambers and Jimmy Cobb decided to move on and form their own band, that left Miles having to put a group together. And two of the guys that he wanted to be in his band was Victor Feldman, who was an amazing keyboard player, also a great drummer, by the way, and percussionist. Very much A-level studio guy, as was Efren Toro back in those days. He was A-level studio guy too, with Joe Porcaro, Ralph Humphrey. And so Frank Butler was like, you know, the guy who was, Miles knew that he was like a super great drummer who could add a lot to the band. So Victor Feldman and Frank Butler became part of the rhythm section when they started making that album to be with the band. Frank Butler decided for one or other reasons that he didn't want to go on the road with a jazz band because he was making a lot of money and he was really entrenched in the studio work here, and it was, you know, and it was a hard thing for him to leave to go out on the road with Miles Davis. My story I heard about Frank Butler is that Miles had the same problem with him right off the bat as he was having with Philly Joe, which was a drug issue where he wasn't showing up for the gig when he was supposed to be there when they were recording. So Miles didn't want to go through that all over again. So it was like, okay, we're not going to have Frank Butler, we're not going to have Philly Joe. We've got part of the album done. They went to New York, and that's when Tony joined the band. So kind of a little gossipy backstory there, but I think some of that's documented too. I don't think the reason why Frank Butler didn't get into the gig was documented so much as just that Miles decided to go with other players, but that's what I heard from people who were around, you know, at the time. So last group, really quick, a band that's one of my favorite rock bands of all time. Have you ever heard of them? You've probably heard of them. Little Village. Elias hasn't heard of them. I don't think Elias has heard of them either. Okay. Graduate, Cal State Northridge, right? Plays in the A band, studying jazz. One of the young up-and-comer best drummers here in LA today. So I'm excited. Okay, everybody's going to hear about this for the first time. This was a band that was formed with superstars. A lot of them were in Ry Cooder's band. John Hyatt, Ry Cooder, Nick Lowe, and the drummer was Jim Keltner. So I get a call from Jim. Jim and I were friends back as teenagers, by the way. I can go on and on about Jim Keltner, one of my favorite drummers, one of my favorite people, one of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. I was introduced to him by a mutual friend that I was playing with who happened to play with him on an occasion, and he said, you've got to hear Jim Keltner. So I went to the Lighthouse, and Jim was playing with a Latin band, and I introduced myself, and he just blew me away, and we became friends right away. He was just a natural musical drummer. So this band comes together in their later years. It's called Little Village. They put out an album. They do some touring. They play on The Tonight Show back in the day. And for, I guess, some multiple reasons, there was conflicts in schedules because you've got Jim Keltner backing up three band leaders, basically, who were coming together to form a new band, who had their own agendas in terms of not the music so much, but you know, they had careers that were going. So how could they keep this band going plus their individual careers going also? So the band only landed for only I believe it was less than a year. But it was kind of fun because I remember Jim calling me and saying, Don, I'm in a band, you know, and he'd never really been in a band before. He'd been hired as a drummer in bands that were traveling, but he had never been like part of a band member in a band where he had to get a drum tech. That was his call. He says, I need a drum tech. We're going to go out on the road. I've never had to hire my own drum tech before. So we did hook him up with a drum tech. I forget who that might have been at the time. But they went out and they put some albums together. And to me, they put an album together, rather. But and they wrote the songs together. It's just a great example of a bunch of guys having fun again, like Terry Gibbs's big band, where there's not a lot of pressure on. They're able to do whatever they want to do, and how if you listen to each song and listen to what Jim does, listen to how un-drummer-like it is, and I mean that as an utmost compliment. 𝗟𝗟𝗓𝗏, another lifetime friend going back to when we were teenagers and used to play together, had a great comment. He said, when you see Jim Keltner play, and they work together a lot, he says, it doesn't look like he's playing drums, it looks more like he's dealing canasta. It's just like very fluid and very relaxed, and it's not like there's any effort going into it at all. And that's the way this band sounded. I picked one track, I forget which one I picked for you to play, Jules, but play this track and let's listen to it together here, and there's a comment I've got about it. And listen to it as a drummer. If somebody's playing this track to you, I bet almost 100% you would not think of playing the rhythm that Jim Keltner is playing.
Well, a love won't last the night if it's built on sand. If it's built on rock,
this is just typical of the whole album.
that it can't withstand.
Obviously in 4, you would naturally put the accent you would think on 2 and 4, but instead of that, he plays it on 2 and adds a pattern at 3 and 4. It becomes part of the rhythmic pattern of the whole song. As opposed to a drum part, it becomes more of the hook of the song. It's as much a part of the song as the lyrics or the harmony is to the song. You listen to it and it just feels so good, it sounds so good. I'd always say, when Jim Keltner walks into the room, for some reason it just feels good. And you feel relaxed. That's the feeling of listening to everything that he plays. He wasn't always Jim Keltner, however. By that I mean, you think of Jim Keltner with all the great work he did in his huge discography of his lifetime, but as teenage, he would play bar mitzvahs, he would play in a polka band, he would play whatever gig that came along to which is a lesson for all of you out there too. Never turn anything down, because you're going to learn a little something from everything as you're growing in your experiences. But it's a whole album that you can pick any other song you want in the album, and you'll hear something similar to this, where it's a little bit different than what you might have thought you would do as a drummer sitting down to play it. And that's the lesson. Think about that when you get into a next musical circumstance where, like, maybe let's try something. Maybe it's a bomb, and maybe it doesn't work at all. You know what you can do that can work, because you can do traditional things that work. To try something like this, it's the reason why you hire Jim Keltner. 𝗟𝗢𝗠𝗕𝗔𝗥𝗗𝗜 told a great story, which was personal to me. He said, there's kind of 3 kinds of gigs. You need a drummer, so you hire a drummer. You need a drummer that sounds like Steve Gadd, so you hire somebody that's really good that can kind of sound as much as they can. Nobody can sound like Steve Gadd, obviously, but the point I'm trying to make. It plays in that kind of a genre. Or you hire Steve Gadd because you can get him and you know exactly what he's going to do, so you're not trying to do something, you know what you're going to get before you get there. And certainly 𝗟𝗟𝗏 in his life, Russ Kunkel, Jim Keltner, a myriad of drummers, who they get hired now, they get hired because they want them to do what they already do, and they know what they're going to get with them. Elias, who we're talking about here, gets hired because he's a drummer, and they know he can play the way great drummers can play. And as he grows in his career, people are going to call him because they know what they get when they hire Elias, because they know what he has done before, and they know what he's going to be bringing to the song. And that takes a degree of confidence, and it takes a degree of you to take that next step to experiment with what's going to be going on next. I hope you enjoyed this. It came to you in an early morning here, which is when we recorded it live, but you can be watching it anytime you want. If you are any questions you might have now or afterwards, let me know. You can get into me. I'll tell you how you can get a hold of me too. But Elias, question?
Yeah, there's one question.
Question coming
about what would be your desert island song? If you were on a desert island,
oh
what
boy,
would be the song or album?
That's if I was on a desert island. That would, and I could only have one, and no internet. What do you mean? I could be on a desert island with no internet? What? How could life go on? So very good question, you know, and I guess I'd have to go back to say, you know, there's back to my wall of drummers, you know. If you had Elvin Jones and Buddy Rich and Mel Lewis and Ringo Starr at the four corners, they all give you a certain amount of things that you just can't believe is happening. Certainly in hearing Mel Lewis, I'd hear him do things that would be like just musically amazing. Ringo Starr does the job that a drummer should do. If you took all the technique away from Buddy Rich, you took the rhythmic sensibility away from Elvin Jones, the way he played, they would still fill the basic foundation of what a drummer does, which is keep time and have a really good feel and play what you're playing so it fits into the song. So I have great, you know, thrill. Looking back at my personal lifetime, I've seen Buddy Rich do things that I couldn't believe. I can reflect on a time when I was playing at a show band in Vegas, and he was playing across the street, and I got to go over and see him play the last set almost every night. One night the Basie band came in from down the street on their off night, and he's always great, and he took it to another level. You would just think, oh, this is like, he really turned it on this night. That was like, that was amazing. Love the Beatles. Mel Lewis played a big band like nobody else has ever played a big band. But I'd have to go with Elvin Jones, because you can't, you know, no matter what's happening in your life, you can't not listen to some of those tracks with Coltrane and not be happy. I could say the same thing with the Dream Band. You can't listen to some of those and not be happy. And I could say the same thing with Buddy Rich. You'd be blown away. So be close between Elvin and Mel in that band, but I would have to go with Elvin Jones, I guess. So that's a very good question. That's a tough one too. So if you're seeing this on demand and you have any other questions, you can go to Don Lombardi at drumchannel.com if you want to ask me some questions, because that's where I get a lot of questions from that website. I can't thank Jules enough for putting on this series here. Jules likes to stay behind the picture. You know, she doesn't like to be on screen too much. And usually I'm not in the same studio or room she is, so since this is the last one, maybe we could walk in there with the camera and see her and have her. She's yelling at me, no, don't do that. So I won't do that. You'll be hearing her yelling any minute. But Jules, fantastic job you've done. All the ones we've had before, check them out. Where can you check these out, Elias, if people wants to see them? On Drum Channel? There, you can't find it better than that. At dwdrums.com, Drum Network. That's where we're at, and it is a network of drummers, which makes it all happen for you. Thank you so much for watching today. Let's go back, Jules, if you can rewind to the Frankie Butler drum solo for just a second. Let's go out with that kind of in the background. If you can grab it for a minute, like the last, before they play the head again, Night in Tunisia. What a great way to go out, because that was unbelievable. That's just, practice that. Don't go to jail in order to learn how to do it. I'm not recommending that, but if you're going to be in jail, he certainly made the best time out of it that anybody possibly could. All right, we'll see you soon. Thanks so much for watching. Check this out one last time.